Right, so picture this. You're scrolling through your podcast feed, and you see it. California Governor Gavin Newsom is launching a new podcast called Golden State Forward.
Interesting.
Yeah, a little surprising, right?
Yeah.
Especially with so much talk about California's challenges lately,
Yeah.
homelessness,
Yeah.
wildfires, all those pandemic policies. It's a lot.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is the timing of this launch. Newsom's approval rating is at 46%, and he's definitely facing some heat, so you have to wonder,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
is this podcast a genuine attempt to connect with voters, or is it a strategic move, to control the narrative?
It really makes you think, because the reaction online has been, well, let's just say the hashtag Gaslighting Gavin is making the rounds.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and for those who might not be familiar with the term gaslighting, it's basically a form of manipulation where someone tries to make you doubt your own reality, and people are using this term to describe their feelings about Newsom's leadership.
I see. So there's this feeling that there's a disconnect between what he's saying and what's actually happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like people are feeling like their struggles are being downplayed.
Right, like that word gaslighting is key here.
Yeah.
It suggests a real sense of distrust and frustration. People feel like there's a disconnect between what Newsom says and what's actually happening in their lives.
Totally. And it's interesting because the trailer for Newsom's podcast is super polished.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Talks about California leading the way in innovation, equity, and leading through crisis.
But that aspirational tone clashes with the realities that a lot of Californians are facing, right?
For sure.
Like, if you're struggling to make rent in a state with a massive housing crisis and then you hear the governor talking about innovation,
Oh, yeah.
it just feels out of touch.
Yeah, totally. And people on social media are calling out this disconnect sometimes with some pretty biting humor.
I bet.
Like journalist Melissa Diaz tweeted, Gaslighting 101, shifting blame while launching a vanity project. Hashtag priorities.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how social media can amplify these feelings. It's not just one person feeling this way, it's becoming part of the public conversation.
Absolutely. And it's not just journalists. Everyday people are chiming in, too.
Oh, I'm sure.
Activist Luis Rivera tweeted, love the policy talks, Gav, but maybe fix BART delays before dropping episode 2.
Uh-huh.
I mean, BART delays are a real pain point for a lot of Californians. So it's a clever way to point out what feels like misplaced priorities.
Yeah, right. It's interesting how these tweets highlight how podcasts, despite their potential for, in-depth discussion, are still subject to the same scrutiny and skepticism as any other form of political communication.
Okay, so we're seeing this gaslighting Gavin narrative emerge.
Right.
To understand it, we need to look at specific instances where people felt this disconnect, like the 2020 French Laundry incident is a classic example.
Exactly. Newsom was photographed at a lavish dinner party at the French Laundry, one of the most expensive restaurants in the country. And this was shortly after urging Californians to stay home and avoid gatherings to prevent the spread of COVID. The images went viral and immediately sparked outrage.
I remember seeing those photos and thinking, wait, is this for real?
Yeah.
It felt so tone deaf, especially when so many people were struggling and making sacrifices.
Right.
It felt like a betrayal of trust for a lot of people.
Yeah, it reinforced that idea that there's one set of rules for the elite and another for everyone else.
Exactly. And then there's the more recent veto of the homeless youth funding bill.
Oh, right.
California has a huge budget surplus, but Newsom cited cost concerns.
So again, it comes down to that perception of disconnect.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have the state with a surplus, and on the other, you have vulnerable youth facing homelessness.
Yeah.
It's hard to reconcile those two realities.
It really is. And it's worth noting that Newsom isn't the first politician to launch a podcast.
Yeah.
Obama, Clinton, even DeSantis have their own shows, so it's clearly becoming a go-to strategy.
Right. Podcasts can be a really powerful tool, offering a direct line to voters, bypassing those traditional media filters.
Yeah.
They allow politicians to control the message and present themselves in a more personal, relatable way.
But as Dr. Maya Singh, a political analyst at UC Berkeley, points out, podcasts need to be more than just talk.
I see.
She says, politicians' podcasts can humanize them, but without tangible results, it's just performative.
Yeah.
Voters want action, not just audio.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. We're living in a world where information is everywhere.
Right.
And people are bombarded with messages to cut through the noise and build trust. Politicians need to walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
So I've talked about all the backlash, but to be fair, we should look at what Newsom's actually trying to do with his podcast, right?
Yeah.
He says he wants to combat misinformation, and present like a more nuanced view of all the challenges that California is facing.
And that's where this whole podcasting trend gets interesting.
Okay.
It offers the potential for deeper engagement than you might see in other media.
Right.
It's not like a soundbite on the news, you know?
Yeah.
Newsom actually has the space to really explain his thinking and, maybe even address criticisms head on.
Right.
Maybe have some really insightful conversations.
I see what you mean, but how much of that is realistic, though?
Yeah.
Given all this distrust we've been talking about, can a podcast actually bridge that gap?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It all comes down to how Newsom approaches it.
Okay.
If it's just him talking at people, reiterating talking points, it's probably going to backfire. People will just see it as spin as another attempt to control the narrative.
So what would make this podcast feel authentic?
Yeah.
What would genuine engagement look like?
Well, for starters, he needs to bring in diverse voices.
Okay.
Like invite guests who disagree with him, you know?
Yeah.
People who represent different communities and perspectives.
Interesting.
Imagine if he had a conversation with someone who was personally impacted by the homeless youth funding veto.
Wow, yeah.
That would be powerful.
It would force him to really listen, and grapple with the real-world consequences of his decisions.
And it would show a willingness to be challenged, to be vulnerable.
Right.
That's what builds trust.
Okay, but let's be realistic. Politicians are all about managing their image.
True.
It's hard to imagine any politician actually embracing that level of transparency and openness.
That's true, but there are examples of politicians using podcasts effectively to have these tougher conversations.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and honestly, Newsom might not have a choice.
Huh?
To salvage his image and connect with voters, he needs to do something different. This podcast could be that opportunity.
We've been focusing a lot on the negative reactions to this podcast, but it's important to remember that Newsom does have supporters
Oh, of course.
who are genuinely excited about this podcast.
Absolutely. And their perspective is important, too.
Yeah.
They see this as a way for him to connect with Californians in a more personal way,
So
to cut through the noise and have real conversations about the issues that matter.
you're saying there is potential for this to be a positive thing? It's
Yeah.
a way to bridge some of the divides in California.
It's definitely possible, but the execution is key.
Right.
Will Newsom use this platform to foster meaningful dialogue,
Yeah.
to really listen and learn, or will it just become another echo chamber?
It all comes back to that question of authenticity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
In a world that's so saturated with information and spin, can we even tell what's genuine anymore?
That's the challenge we all face.
Yeah.
Not just in politics, but in every aspect of our lives,
Right.
We're constantly bombarded with messages trying to figure out who to trust, what to believe.
It's exhausting.
It really is.
This whole deep dive has really made that clear.
Yeah.
This whole situation with Newsom's podcast is like a microcosm of this larger struggle we're all facing
Right.
in navigating this crazy media landscape.
It is, and it highlights the need for critical thinking,
Mhm.
for being discerning about the information we consume and the sources we trust.
Speaking of sources, there's one more layer to this whole Gaslighting Gavin narrative that we haven't really touched on yet.
Okay.
In addition to the French Laundry incident and the homeless youth funding veto, there's been a lot of criticism of Newsom's handling of the pandemic,
Yeah.
particularly the lockdown policies and vaccine mandates.
Oh, right. That was a really contentious period.
Yeah,
California had some of the strictest COVID-19 restrictions in the country.
for sure.
A lot of people felt that Newsom overreached his authority and infringed on their personal freedoms.
And those feelings were only amplified by the fact that, well, let's just say Newsom didn't always seem to be following the rules he was imposing on everyone else.
You're bringing up the French Laundry incident again.
Well, yeah, it's a prime example.
Right.
But there were other instances, too, like he was seen attending a football game without a mask,
Really?
even though fans were required to wear them.
Right. Those inconsistencies definitely contributed to this erosion of trust. It created that sense of do as I say, not as I do, which further fueled the gaslighting accusations.
Because that's a key element of gaslighting, isn't it?
Yeah.
This feeling that you're being treated unfairly, that there's a double standard.
Absolutely. It's about making people doubt their own perceptions.
Right.
And experiences making them feel like they're overreacting or being too sensitive.
And when that comes from someone in a position of power, like a governor,
Right.
it can be incredibly damaging.
It erodes trust in institutions, fosters cynicism, and makes it incredibly difficult to have productive conversations about important issues.
So this whole gaslighting Gavin phenomenon isn't just about Newsom's actions. It's a symptom of something much larger.
Yeah.
This growing distrust in leadership and institutions.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
We're living in a time of heightened political polarization and social fragmentation. It's getting harder and harder to find common ground and have civil discourse.
For sure.
And that's incredibly dangerous.
Because if we can't even agree on basic facts and principles, how are we supposed to solve all these really complex challenges facing our society?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one that I don't have an easy answer for.
Right.
But I do think it's a conversation worth having.
Maybe this is a good point to wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the specifics of Newsom's podcast and the Gaslighting Gavin narrative to these larger questions about trust, authenticity, and the challenges of communicating in the digital age.
I agree. And it's clear that this conversation is far from over.
It feels like we're just scratching the surface.
Yeah.
The story of Gaslighting Gavin and this podcast paradox is still unfolding.
And it's going to be fascinating to see where it leads us.
Okay, so where do we go from here? We've got Governor Newsom diving headfirst into this world of podcasts, facing all this criticism and distrust, and Californians are trying to figure it all out. It's messy.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it just shows how complicated the relationship between politics and media has become, especially with social media.
All right.
On the one hand, you have this really innovative approach. Newsom's trying to reach people, directly bypass all the traditional media filters, and maybe even have more nuanced conversations than you usually get, on the news.
But on the other hand, there's that skepticism we've been talking about.
Yeah.
It's hard not to wonder if this is all just a calculated performance, a way to control the narrative and, smooth over some rough edges.
It's a valid concern, and it's not just about Newsom. This is happening across the board. Podcasts are becoming a key part of the modern political playbook, but that brings up some big questions.
Yeah.
How do we ensure transparency? How do we hold politicians accountable when they're increasingly controlling their own message?
Yeah, because it's so easy to get swept up in the production.
Yeah.
The carefully chosen words.
Yeah.
The whole curated image, especially with social media amplifying everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why it's more important than ever to be critical of the information you're taking and question everything, look for different perspectives, and don't just focus on what politicians are saying. Look at what they're actually doing. Actions always speak louder than words, especially in politics.
Which brings us back to Governor Newsom and his podcast.
Yeah.
Will he actually use this platform to have these genuine conversations with Californians, address their concerns, offer real solutions, or will it just be more of the same, just repackaged?
Honestly, I don't have a crystal ball. Only time will tell, but one thing's for sure.
What's that?
All eyes are on him right now, not just in California, but across the whole country. This podcast could be a turning point.
Interesting.
It could be a model for how to govern transparently and accountably in the digital age, or it could just become another cautionary tale about the limits of spin.
It's definitely a fascinating case study. And for everyone listening, this is a reminder that you have a role to play in all of this. Stay informed, be critical, ask tough questions, and demand more from your leaders.
Well said. And don't be afraid to challenge the narrative. Speak up about the issues that matter to you. Your voice matters more than you think.
This deep dive has been quite a journey.
It has.
We've unpacked so much political strategy, the dynamics of social media, the psychology of gaslighting, and so much more. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
But I hope you've walked away with some new insights,
Yeah.
some things to think about, and maybe even a little more hope for the future.
And who knows, maybe this will inspire you to start your own deep dive into something you're passionate about.
I like that.
Because in a world where information is constantly being, spun around and remixed, we all have a responsibility to search for the truth and, try to understand it all. And sometimes the best way to do that is to dive right in and see where it takes you.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.